The morning sun cast harsh geometric shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackstone, Meyer and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious family law firms. Marcus Wellington adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. Today would be the day he finally rid himself of the dead weight that had been dragging down his success for the past 15 years. Before we dive into what happened in that courtroom, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Are you in a place where you've seen people underestimate others based on appearances? Drop a comment and let me know your state or country, because what happened to Marcus happens to arrogant people everywhere, and you'll want to stick around for this. Claire Wellington sat in the reception area, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a simple navy dress that Marcus had always said made her look frumpy. Her brown hair was pulled back in the same modest ponytail she'd worn for years, and her wedding ring, a small solitaire that Marcus had grudgingly purchased when his startup was struggling, caught the light as she turned the pages of a magazine without really reading. Marcus emerged from the elevator with his attorney, Richard Blackstone himself, a man whose reputation for dismantling marriages was legendary among the city's elite. Blackstone stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with silver hair perfectly styled and a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His pale blue eyes held the predatory gleam of a shark who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Marcus looked every inch the successful entrepreneur he'd become. His thick black hair was expertly styled, his jaw clean-shaven and sharp, and his navy suit was tailored to perfection. At 42, he'd maintained his athletic build through expensive personal training sessions and had the confidence that came from years of people telling him he was destined for greatness. Marcus's voice carried clearly across the marble lobby as he spoke to Blackstone. "She's been living off my success for 15 years, Richard. All she's ever done is raise the kids and spend my money. Now that Emma and Tyler are in college, she thinks she deserves half of everything I've built." The man's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "She's delusional if she thinks any judge will side with a housewife over a self-made millionaire." Claire's eyes remained fixed on her magazine, but the slightest tightening around her eyes suggested she had heard every word. Her attorney, Margaret Shun, emerged from the hallway at that moment, a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair cut in a sharp bob and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a conservative black suit that somehow managed to convey both professionalism and quiet authority. Shun approached Claire with a confident stride, her low heels clicking against the marble floor. "Mrs. Wellington," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for Marcus to hear, "are you ready to show them who you really are?" Marcus turned at the sound, his expression shifting from amusement to mild irritation. "Margaret Shun," he said with a condescending nod, "I'm surprised you took this case. Even someone with your reputation can't make something from nothing, and Claire has contributed exactly nothing to our marriage except playing house." Chen's smile was enigmatic as she helped Claire to her feet. "Mr. Wellington," she replied calmly, "I think you'll find that today will be quite educational for everyone involved." She turned to Claire, whose posture had straightened almost imperceptibly. "Shall we proceed to the conference room?" As they walked toward the glass-walled conference room, Marcus couldn't help but notice something different about Claire's demeanor. Gone was the nervous energy she'd displayed during their separation discussions. Instead, there was a calmness, an almost serene confidence that he'd never seen before. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. The conference room was a monument to legal intimidation, with its massive mahogany table, leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, and walls lined with law books whose leather spines had never been cracked. Blackstone had chosen this room deliberately, knowing that its opulence and formality would reinforce the power dynamic he intended to establish. Marcus took his seat across from Claire with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Blackstone opened his leather portfolio with theatrical precision, the sound of expensive paper rustling filling the silence. Claire sat quietly, her hands still folded, while Chun arranged her own documents with methodical care. "Gentlemen," Blackstone began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in family law, "we're here today to discuss what should be a straightforward division of assets in the Wellington divorce. My client has built a considerable fortune through his technology consulting business, Wellington Dynamics, along with substantial real estate holdings and investment portfolios. Mrs. Wellington, having chosen to remain unemployed throughout their marriage, has no legitimate claim to the assets my client acquired through his own effort and acumen. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. Claire's been a stay-at-home mom by choice, he said, his tone making it clear he considered this a character flaw rather than a contribution. While I was building my business from nothing, working 18-hour days, making the connections and deals that created our wealth, she was at home playing with finger paints and driving carpool. Now she wants to pretend that raising our children somehow entitles her to half of what I earned. Chen made a note on her legal pad, her expression remaining neutral. Mr. Wellington, she said calmly, I'm curious about your definition of building something from nothing. Could you elaborate on the initial capital that started Wellington Dynamics? The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. I secured investors based on my vision and business plan, he said firmly. I had the contacts, the expertise, the drive to make it happen. Claire had nothing to do with any of it. Blackstone nodded approvingly. My client's entrepreneurial success speaks for itself, he said. Wellington Dynamics now generates over $3 million annually, and Mr. Wellington's real estate investments have appreciated considerably. Mrs. Wellington's domestic contributions, while perhaps emotionally valuable, have no legal bearing on asset division. Claire spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. Marcus, do you remember the night you came home after losing the Peterson account? You said we might have to sell the house because the business couldn't survive without that contract. Marcus's jaw tightened. That was years ago, and we obviously didn't lose the house. I found other clients, bigger contracts. I saved the business through my own efforts. Chen leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Wellington, could you tell us about that particular evening? Take your time. Claire's voice remained steady. Marcus was devastated. He'd put everything into landing Peterson Industries as a client, and when they chose a competitor, he felt like his whole world was crashing down. He kept saying we were going to lose everything, that he'd failed as a provider. She paused, glancing at Marcus, whose expression had grown stony. I told him that everything would be okay, that we'd find a way through it together. Blackstone waved dismissively. Emotional support during difficult times is admirable, but has no monetary value in divorce proceedings. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Of course not, she agreed. But I'm curious about the practical aspects of that evening. Mrs. Wellington, after you comforted your husband, what specific actions did you take? For the first time since entering the room, Claire's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. I made some phone calls, she said simply. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Claire always had a talent for networking, he said quickly. She was good at organizing school events, keeping up with the other mothers. Social butterfly stuff. Chen's eyes held a glint that Blackstone was beginning to find unsettling. Mrs. Wellington, could you be more specific about those phone calls? Claire looked directly at Marcus for the first time since they'd entered the room. I called my college roommate Sarah, who had become a senior executive at Peterson Industries. I explained the situation and asked if there was any way to reconsider the contract decision. She said they'd been impressed with Marcus's proposal, but had concerns about his company's financial stability and long-term viability. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus's face had gone pale. You never told me you called Peterson, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chen continued calmly. What was the outcome of that conversation, Mrs. Wellington? Claire's voice remained steady, but there was something new in it now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Sarah said that if I could personally guarantee Wellington Dynamics stability and provide assurance of the company's backing, Peterson would be willing to reconsider. So I did. Marcus's recovery was swift and brutal. He leaned forward across the mahogany table, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Claire with the intensity of a predator cornering wounded prey. Making a few phone calls to your sorority sisters doesn't make you a business partner, Claire, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You're grasping at straws, trying to take credit for my success because you know you have nothing else to offer. Blackstone sensed his client's agitation and moved to regain control of the narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced as if addressing a courtroom rather than a conference room. What we're witnessing here is a classic case of a dependent spouse attempting to rewrite history. Mrs. Wellington's social connections may have facilitated an introduction, but Mr. Wellington's expertise and business acumen secured and maintained the Peterson contract for over a decade. Marcus nodded vigorously, his confidence returning as he warmed to his theme. Claire has always been good at playing telephone with her little social circle, he said dismissively. But running a multi-million-dollar technology consulting firm requires actual skills, actual knowledge, actual work. She wouldn't know a profit margin from a profit-sharing plan. Chin remained silent, taking notes with deliberate precision, while Claire sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. The only sign of emotion was the slight tremor in her fingers, barely visible, but enough to encourage Marcus's growing aggression. Let me paint you a picture of our typical day over the past 15 years, Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more animated. I'm up at 5:30 every morning, reviewing market reports and preparing for client meetings. By the time Claire rolls out of bed at 9, I've already been working for 3 hours. While she's having coffee and watching morning television, I'm negotiating million-dollar contracts. While she's at the grocery store or the gym, I'm building relationships with Fortune 500 executives. He stood up and began pacing behind his chair, a gesture Blackstone recognized as his client's way of commanding attention. Claire's idea of a hard day is when the kids have soccer practice and she has to drive them across town. My idea of a hard day is when I'm flying to 3 different cities to close deals that keep our family living in luxury. The conference room door opened quietly, and a young woman entered. She was perhaps 28 years old, with platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves and wearing a form-fitting red dress that left little to the imagination. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry expensive, and her smile was directed exclusively at Marcus. This was Amber Stevens, Marcus's girlfriend of the past 8 months, a fact that everyone in the room understood without introduction. Amber took a seat in one of the chairs positioned along the wall, crossing her long legs with practiced precision. Her presence was clearly intended to send a message to Claire about her replacement, and the smirk playing at the corners of her mouth suggested she was enjoying the show. Marcus's posture straightened even further with Amber's arrival, his chest puffing out like a peacock displaying his plumage. You want to know what Claire contributed to our marriage, he said, gesturing toward his estranged wife with theatrical disdain. She contributed exactly what every other suburban housewife contributes. She packed lunches, she folded laundry, she attended PTA meetings. Valuable work, I'm sure, but hardly the foundation of a business empire. Blackstone opened a thick folder and began removing documents with ceremonial gravity. Mr. Wellington has provided extensive documentation of his sole ownership of all marital assets, he announced. Business incorporation papers showing Mr. Wellington as founder and president of Wellington Dynamics. Real estate deeds listing Mr. Wellington as primary owner of the family residence, the vacation home in Aspen, and the rental properties in downtown. Investment account statements showing Mr. Wellington as account holder and decision maker for all portfolio management. Each document was placed on the table with deliberate emphasis, creating a growing pile of paper that seemed to physically represent Marcus's dominance over their shared financial life. Claire's eyes darted briefly toward the documents before returning to her folded hands, and Marcus interpreted this glance as defeat. You see, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the triumphant tone of someone delivering a closing argument. Claire never worked a day in her adult life. While other women were building careers, advancing in their fields, making actual contributions to society, Claire was playing house. She chose the easy path, the comfortable path, the path of complete dependence on someone else's success. Amber's smirk widened, and she made a small sound of agreement that was just loud enough to be heard across the room. Claire's shoulders seemed to draw inward slightly, as if she were trying to make herself smaller and less visible. Chin finally looked up from her notes, her expression unreadable. Mr. Wellington, she said calmly, you've mentioned that your wife never worked. Could you clarify what you mean by work in this context? Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the conference room's glass walls. I mean, she never had a job, never earned a paycheck, never contributed financially to our household in any meaningful way. She lived off my income for 15 years while I built our fortune from nothing. And the children, Chun continued in the same neutral tone, who managed their schedules, their education, their health care, their extracurricular activities. Marcus waved dismissively. Any parent handles those responsibilities. That's just basic child rearing, not a career. Claire made it sound like a full-time job because she had nothing else to fill her days. Other working mothers manage their children's needs while also contributing financially to their families. Blackstone nodded approvingly. The courts have consistently recognized that domestic labor, while personally meaningful, does not constitute grounds for equal division of assets acquired through one spouse's professional efforts. Claire spoke so quietly that everyone had to lean forward to hear her. Marcus, do you remember when Tyler broke his arm during your presentation to Morrison Electronics? Marcus's jaw tightened with irritation. What does that have to do with anything? Kids get hurt. Parents deal with it. That doesn't make Claire a business partner. Chin's pen moved steadily across her legal pad. Mrs. Wellington, could you provide more details about that particular incident? Claire's voice remained soft, but there was something new beneath the surface, a current of strength that hadn't been there moments before. Tyler fell off his bike on a Saturday morning while Marcus was presenting our proposal to Morrison Electronics in Chicago. It was a complicated fracture that required immediate surgery. I spent 14 hours in the hospital while Tyler underwent multiple procedures. She paused, glancing briefly at Marcus, whose expression had grown stony. The surgeon said Tyler would need extensive physical therapy and specialized care for the next 6 months. There would be multiple appointments each week, and someone would need to coordinate with his teachers about modified schedules and assistance with schoolwork. So you took care of it, Chin said, as any good mother would. Claire nodded slowly. I took care of it, but I also did something else that weekend. The silence stretched across the conference room like a taut wire. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her smirk beginning to fade as she sensed something changing in the atmosphere. I called Morrison Electronics on Monday morning, Claire continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I explained that there had been a family emergency, but that Wellington Dynamics remained fully committed to the project. I provided them with detailed timelines, revised project milestones, and additional resources that could be allocated to ensure their needs were met without delay. Marcus's face had gone pale again. You never told me you called Morrison, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chin leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Wellington, what was the outcome of that conversation? Claire looked directly at Marcus, and for the first time since entering the room, her posture was perfectly straight. Morrison was impressed with the level of personal attention and commitment. They said it demonstrated the kind of dedication and follow-through they expected from a long-term partner. They signed a 3-year extension that same week. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus stared at Claire as if seeing her for the first time, while Blackstone frantically shuffled through his documents, clearly looking for something that would restore his client's narrative. That's impossible, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. Morrison signed because of my presentation, because of the technical specifications I provided, because of the competitive pricing structure I developed. You making a phone call didn't close a multi-million-dollar deal. Chin's smile was patient, almost maternal. Mrs. Wellington, beyond the Morrison contract, were there other instances where you provided similar assistance to Wellington Dynamics? Claire's transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. The tremor in her hands had stopped, her posture had straightened, and there was something in her eyes now that Amber found deeply unsettling. The other woman's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by growing concern about what she was witnessing. There were many instances, Claire said simply. When Marcus was struggling to secure the Henderson account, I researched their company culture and suggested he modify his approach to emphasize collaborative partnerships rather than vendor relationships. When the Taylor Group was considering terminating their contract due to communication issues, I developed a client feedback system that improved satisfaction scores by 40%. Marcus was shaking his head vigorously. You're exaggerating isolated incidents into grand contributions, he said desperately. Those were just conversations between husband and wife, casual suggestions that any spouse might make. You didn't write the proposals, you didn't negotiate the contracts, you didn't manage the client relationships. Chin nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Wellington makes an interesting distinction between casual suggestions and business contributions. Mrs. Wellington, did you ever provide more than casual suggestions? Claire was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward. Marcus, do you remember the night you came home and said Wellington Dynamics might have to file for bankruptcy? The color drained from Marcus's face completely. Amber's eyes darted between them, confusion replacing her earlier smugness. Blackstone stopped shuffling papers and focused intently on his client, recognizing a moment of crisis. That was, Marcus began, then stopped. His voice when he continued was barely audible. That was during the recession. Everyone was struggling. Cash flow was impossible. We owed more than we could collect. Chin's voice remained gentle but relentless. Mrs. Wellington, what happened that night? Claire's response came with the quiet authority of someone stating an undeniable fact. I told Marcus that bankruptcy wasn't an option because too many people depended on Wellington Dynamics for their livelihoods. I told him I would handle it. And how exactly did you handle it? Chin asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Claire looked directly at Marcus, and in her eyes was something he'd never seen before, something that made him shrink back in his leather chair. I made an investment, she said simply. The conference room felt like it was holding its breath. Amber shifted nervously, her expensive jewelry suddenly feeling too heavy. Blackstone found himself gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Marcus's voice when he found it was weak and shaky. What kind of investment? Claire's smile was serene, almost peaceful. The kind that saved your company and made everything else possible. Chin closed her notebook with a soft snap that seemed to echo in the silence. Gentlemen, she said, rising from her chair with fluid grace, I believe we've heard enough for today. Tomorrow we'll be presenting evidence that will clarify exactly how all of these assets were acquired and who is truly responsible for their accumulation. She turned to Claire, who stood as well, her movement confident and controlled. Mrs. Wellington, shall we allow Mr. Wellington time to review his records and prepare for tomorrow's revelations? As they moved toward the door, Chin paused and looked back at Marcus and Blackstone, both of whom remained frozen in their seats. Oh, and Mr. Wellington, she said with the faintest trace of amusement, you might want to call your accountant tonight. I think you're going to need him. The next morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a legal machine grinding into motion. The conference room at Blackstone, Meyer and Associates had been transformed overnight into something resembling a courtroom, with additional chairs arranged for what promised to be a more formal proceeding. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed harsher somehow, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany table that now groaned under the weight of document boxes and legal files. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, his usual swagger replaced by the nervous energy of a man who had spent the night staring at his ceiling instead of sleeping. His Italian suit was immaculate as always, but there were dark circles under his eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. He'd called his accountant, as Chun had suggested, only to discover that Robert had been trying to reach him for months about discrepancies in the company's ownership structure that had somehow gone unnoticed. Blackstone entered the room carrying 3 additional files, and wearing the expression of a man who had discovered his supposedly solid case was built on quicksand. His usual confidence had been replaced by the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. He'd spent hours the previous evening making phone calls to contacts in the property records office, and what he'd learned had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the Wellington marriage. Claire arrived with Margaret Chun at exactly 9 o'clock, and the transformation from the previous day was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Gone was the modest navy dress, replaced by a charcoal gray suit that managed to be both professional and elegant. Her hair, instead of the usual ponytail, was styled in a sophisticated chignon that revealed the strong line of her jaw and the intelligence in her dark eyes. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who belonged in rooms where million-dollar decisions were made. Chin's assistant wheeled in a cart loaded with document boxes, each one labeled with meticulous precision. The young man, dressed in an expensive suit that suggested Chin's practice was far more successful than anyone had realized, began arranging files on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Amber had returned as well, though her red dress from the previous day had been replaced by something more subdued, as if she sensed that her role as the smirking symbol of Marcus's victory might need adjustment. She took the same seat along the wall, but her earlier confidence had been replaced by visible anxiety as she watched Claire's entrance with growing concern. "Good morning, everyone," Chun said as she took her position at the head of the table. "Yesterday we heard Mr. Wellington's version of how the assets in this marriage were acquired and accumulated. Today we're going to examine the documentary evidence that tells a different story. She opened the first file with deliberate ceremony, removing a thick document bound in official blue covers. This morning I'd like to begin with the real property owned by the Wellington family, starting with the family residence at 1247 Elm Ridge Drive. Marcus leaned forward, his confidence returning slightly. The house was purchased in 2008 for $450,000, he said firmly. I secured the mortgage based on my income and credit rating. Claire wasn't even working at the time, so she couldn't have qualified for financing on her own. She nodded politely. You're absolutely correct about the purchase price and the date, Mr. Wellington. However, I think you might be mistaken about some of the other details. She turned to the first page of the document, her finger tracing a specific line. According to the warranty deed recorded with the county clerk's office, the purchaser and sole owner of 1247 Elm Ridge Drive is Claire Elizabeth Wellington, unmarried woman. The silence that followed was so complete that the humming of the building's ventilation system became audible. Marcus stared at Chun as if she had just announced that gravity had been repealed, while Blackstone frantically reached for his own copy of what should have been routine property records. That's impossible, Marcus said, his voice climbing in pitch. The mortgage application, the insurance policies, the property taxes, everything is in my name. I've been paying the mortgage for 15 years. Chun turned to the next page of the document. The warranty deed shows that the property was purchased with cash, Mr. Wellington. There never was a mortgage. The document is signed by Claire Elizabeth Wellington and dated March 15, 2008, which I believe was 3 months before your wedding. Blackstone was now flipping through his own files with increasing desperation. Richard, Marcus said urgently, turning to his attorney, you verified the property records. You said everything was in my name. Blackstone's face had gone ashen. I checked the tax records, he said slowly. The property tax bills have been sent to Marcus Wellington since the purchase. I assumed that meant he was the owner. Chin's smile was patient, almost sympathetic. Mr. Blackstone, as I'm sure you know, property tax bills are often sent to whoever pays them, regardless of actual ownership. In this case, Mr. Wellington has indeed been paying the property taxes on his wife's house for the past 15 years. Marcus stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice now openly panicked. Claire didn't have any money in 2008. She was working part-time at some nonprofit, making barely enough to cover her car payment. She couldn't have bought a house for cash. Chin opened a second file, this one containing bank records. According to these statements from First National Bank, on March 10, 2008, Claire Wellington transferred $450,000 from her investment account to complete the cash purchase of 1247 Elm Ridge Drive. Where did she get $450,000? Marcus demanded, his professional composure completely shattered. She was making maybe $20,000 a year. She lived in a studio apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda. Chun turned to another document. The investment account was funded by the sale of inherited property that Mrs. Wellington received from her grandmother's estate. Property that, according to these records, she had owned since she was 21 years old. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her earlier smugness now completely replaced by confusion and growing alarm. This was not the narrative she had been sold about Marcus's success and Claire's dependence. Marcus was pacing now, his hands running through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. Even if Claire bought the house before we were married, he said desperately, it became marital property when we got married. I've paid for all the improvements, all the maintenance, all the taxes for 15 years. She nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting legal theory, Mr. Wellington. However, the property deed was never modified after your marriage. Mrs. Wellington remained the sole owner throughout your marriage, and you were essentially her tenant, though I understand the arrangement was informal and no rent was charged. Blackstone was now sweating despite the conference room's air conditioning. Margaret, he said, his voice strained, even if Claire owns the primary residence, surely the other properties are in Marcus's name. The vacation home in Aspen, the rental properties downtown. Chin opened a third file. I'm glad you brought up the Aspen property, Richard. The ski lodge at 892 Mountain View Drive was purchased in 2012 for $700,000. According to this warranty deed, the purchaser and sole owner is Claire Elizabeth Wellington, married woman. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at Chun as if she had just performed a magic trick. That's impossible, he whispered. I found that property. I negotiated the price. I arranged the financing. Chun consulted the document again. Actually, Mr. Wellington, like the primary residence, the Aspen property was purchased with cash. No financing was involved. The transaction was completed on June 3, 2012, and the funds came from Mrs. Wellington's investment portfolio. But I've been paying the property taxes, Marcus said weakly. I've been paying the insurance, the maintenance, the HOA fees. Just as you have with the primary residence, Chun agreed. Mrs. Wellington has allowed you to manage the financial obligations of properties she owns, but management is not the same as ownership. Blackstone reached for his phone with shaking hands. I need to call the title company, he said. There has to be some mistake. My client has been treating these properties as his own for years. He's claimed them on tax returns, used them as collateral for business loans. Chen's expression grew serious for the first time that morning. Mr. Blackstone, I hope you're not suggesting that your client has been fraudulently representing ownership of properties that belong to his wife. That could have serious legal implications beyond just divorce proceedings. Marcus slumped back into his chair, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Margaret, he said, his voice barely audible, what about the downtown rental properties? Those have to be mine. I bought those as investments. I manage them personally. Chen opened yet another file, this one thicker than the previous ones. The downtown properties are indeed interesting, Mr. Wellington. Let's start with the building at 425 Commerce Street, purchased in 2015 for $1.2 million. She held up another warranty deed. Purchaser and sole owner, Claire Elizabeth Wellington. Marcus made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. This is insane, he said to no one in particular. I don't understand what's happening. I've been living in my own house, managing my own properties, building my own business empire. Chen's voice was gentle but relentless. Mr. Wellington, perhaps the issue is with your definition of ownership. You've been managing these properties excellently, I'm sure, but management and ownership are two very different things. Amber stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I think, she said in a voice that was higher than usual, I think maybe I should go. She gathered her purse with hands that were visibly shaking and headed toward the door without looking back at Marcus. Marcus called after her, but she was already gone, the click of her heels fading down the hallway. When he turned back to the table, Chun was opening another file. Now, she said with the calm efficiency of someone checking items off a list, shall we discuss the commercial properties that house Wellington Dynamics? Chen opened the next file with the same methodical precision she had used for the residential properties, but there was something different in her demeanor now, a sense that they were approaching the heart of the matter. The document she withdrew was thicker than the others, bound in official corporate filing covers that bore the seal of the Delaware Secretary of State. Marcus watched her movements with the fascination of a man observing his own execution, while Blackstone had given up any pretense of confidence and was frantically taking notes as if documentation might somehow save his client from complete professional humiliation. Mr. Wellington, Chen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. You've mentioned several times that you built Wellington Dynamics from nothing. I'd like to examine the building that houses your corporate headquarters at 1500 Technology Drive. Marcus straightened slightly in his chair, grasping for any remaining thread of control. That's a 15,000 square foot facility that I purchased in 2010, he said with desperate authority. It's worth over $2 million today. I chose that location specifically for its proximity to the airport and the tech corridor. Every major decision about that building went through me. Chen nodded politely as she turned to the first page of the corporate documents. The building at 1500 Technology Drive was indeed purchased in 2010, she confirmed. However, according to this warranty deed filed with the county, the purchaser and sole owner is Elmridge Holdings LLC. Blackstone looked up from his frantic note-taking. That's obviously one of Marcus's holding companies, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It's common practice for business owners to use corporate entities for property purchases. Chen's smile was patient. That's an excellent point, Mr. Blackstone. Let's examine the corporate structure of Elmridge Holdings LLC. She turned to another document. According to the Articles of Incorporation filed with Delaware, Elmridge Holdings LLC has a single member and managing partner. That member is Claire Elizabeth Wellington. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Marcus's pen dropping onto the mahogany table. He stared at the document as if it might burst into flames if he looked at it hard enough. "That can't be right," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I manage that property. I make all the decisions about maintenance, about leasing, about improvements. I've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in upgrades." Chen consulted another page. "You're absolutely correct about managing the property, Mr. Wellington. According to these records, Elmridge Holdings LLC pays you a management fee of $10,000 monthly for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the building. You've been an excellent property manager for Mrs. Wellington's real estate investment." Marcus stood up again, his movements sharp and agitated. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "I don't work for Claire. Claire worked. She didn't work at all. She stayed home with the kids while I built a business empire." Chen opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be business incorporation documents. "Speaking of business empires, Mr. Wellington, let's discuss Wellington Dynamics itself. You've described yourself as the founder and president of the company." Finally, Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "Wellington Dynamics is incorporated in my name. I founded it in 2009. I'm the president, the majority shareholder, the decision maker. Claire has never had any involvement with the actual business operations." Chen removed a thick document from the file. "These are the amended articles of incorporation for Wellington Dynamics, filed in 2015. She turned to a specific page and ran her finger down a column of numbers. "According to these filings, Wellington Dynamics has two classes of stock. Class A shares carry voting rights and operational control. Class B shares are non-voting but represent equity ownership." Marcus leaned forward, his confidence returning slightly. "Exactly. I hold all the Class A shares, which means I control the company. The Class B shares were issued to raise capital, but they don't give outside investors any say in how the business is run." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "You're correct about the structure, Mr. Wellington. You do indeed hold 100% of the Class A shares, giving you complete operational control of Wellington Dynamics. However, according to these documents, the Class B shares represent 60% of the company's total equity value." "So what?" Marcus said dismissively. "Non-voting shares are essentially just a profit-sharing arrangement. I still own and control the company." Chen turned to the next page. "The question isn't about control, Mr. Wellington. The question is about ownership of the equity value. According to these filings, all of the Class B shares in Wellington Dynamics are held by a single entity. That entity is Elmridge Holdings LLC." The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications became clear. Since Elmridge Holdings is owned entirely by Mrs. Wellington, she effectively owns 60% of Wellington Dynamics while you retain operational control through your Class A shares. Marcus's voice when he found it was weak and shaky. "That's impossible. I would have had to approve any stock issuance. I would have had to sign documents. I would remember selling 60% of my company." Chen opened another file. "Actually, Mr. Wellington, you did approve the stock issuance. In fact, you requested it." She withdrew a letter written on Wellington Dynamics letterhead. "This is your written request to the Board of Directors, dated March 3, 2015, asking for authorization to issue Class B shares to Elmridge Holdings in exchange for a capital infusion of $2.5 million. Marcus stared at the letter, his own signature clearly visible at the bottom. "I don't understand," he said helplessly. "Why would I give away 60% of my company? What capital infusion?" Chen consulted yet another document. According to these bank records, on March 5, 2015, Elmridge Holdings LLC transferred $2.5 million to Wellington Dynamics operating account. This was the same week that Wellington Dynamics was facing potential bankruptcy due to the loss of 3 major contracts and outstanding debts of over $3 million. The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he slumped back in his chair as the events of 2015 came flooding back. "We were 3 days away from missing payroll," he said quietly. "We owed suppliers, we had lease obligations, we had 22 employees depending on us for their livelihoods. I was desperate." Chen's voice remained gentle. "What happened during those 3 days, Mr. Wellington?" Marcus closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. Claire said she could help. She said she had access to capital that could save the company. She said there would be paperwork involved, but that I shouldn't worry about the details, that the important thing was keeping everyone employed. And you signed the documents, Chin prompted. Marcus nodded without opening his eyes. I signed everything she put in front of me. I thought she was arranging a loan from her family or something. I didn't read the fine print. I was just grateful that someone was willing to save the company. Blackstone was frantically flipping through documents, searching for something that might salvage his client's position. Margaret, he said desperately, even if Claire has equity ownership, Marcus built the company. His expertise, his relationships, his management, that has to count for something. Chin opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be correspondence and strategic planning documents. That's an interesting point, Richard. Let's examine who actually developed the strategic direction that made Wellington Dynamics successful. She withdrew a series of emails and memos. These are internal communications between Mr. and Mrs. Wellington from 2016 through 2019. She selected one document and read aloud. From Claire Wellington to Marcus Wellington, dated June 15, 2016. Quote, Marcus, I've reviewed the Morrison contract renewal terms. Their technical requirements have evolved beyond traditional consulting. I recommend we pivot toward comprehensive digital transformation services. I've researched their organizational structure and believe we should propose a partnership model rather than a vendor relationship. End quote. Marcus looked up, confusion replacing panic. I remember that email, he said slowly. Claire was always good at research. She would spend hours online learning about our clients' businesses. Chin selected another document. From Claire Wellington to Marcus Wellington, dated September 3, 2017. Quote, the Taylor Group feedback indicates dissatisfaction with our communication protocols. I've developed a client management system that will provide real-time project updates and milestone tracking. Implementation should begin immediately to prevent contract termination. End quote. That was Claire's idea, Marcus admitted quietly. The client management system increased our retention rate by 40%. Chun continued reading from the correspondence. From Claire Wellington to Marcus Wellington, dated February 12, 2018. Quote, Peterson Industries is expanding into European markets. I recommend we develop international capability to maintain our position as their primary consulting partner. I've identified 3 European firms that could provide strategic alliances without requiring significant capital investment. End quote. Marcus was staring at the table, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. The European expansion generated over $800,000 in new revenue in the first year, he said mechanically. Chun withdrew the final document from the file. Mr. Wellington, these communications span 4 years and include over 200 strategic recommendations from Mrs. Wellington to you. According to these records, 91% of her recommendations were implemented exactly as suggested, and those implementations resulted in measurable improvements in revenue, client satisfaction, or operational efficiency. The conference room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Marcus sat motionless, his understanding of his own success completely rewritten in the space of an hour. Blackstone made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Margaret, he said weakly, even if Claire provided strategic advice, Marcus was the face of the company. He made the presentations, he built the relationships, he managed the day-to-day operations. Chin nodded graciously. You're absolutely correct, Richard. Mr. Wellington has been an excellent president and operational manager for Mrs. Wellington's company. She turned to Marcus with something approaching sympathy. Mr. Wellington, I have one final question about your educational background. Marcus looked up, grateful for any change of subject. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science from State University, he said. I graduated in 2007 with a 3.2 GPA. And Mrs. Wellington, Chun continued, what is her educational background? Claire spoke for the first time since entering the room that morning, her voice clear and confident. I have an MBA in strategic management from Wharton, she said simply. I graduated summa cum laude in 2006. Marcus stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time in 15 years. You never told me you had an MBA, he whispered. Claire's smile was serene, almost peaceful. Marcus, she said gently, In 15 years of marriage, you never asked about my education. You assumed that because I chose to stay home with our children, I must not have had any other options. Chun closed the final file with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the stunned silence of the conference room. Gentlemen, she said, rising from her chair, I believe we now have a clearer picture of how the Wellington family assets were acquired and who was responsible for their accumulation. Tomorrow we'll be discussing the financial structures that supported this business empire and exactly where the working capital came from. She turned to Claire, who stood as well with fluid grace. Mrs. Wellington, shall we allow Mr. Wellington time to consult with his accountant about the ownership structures we've discussed today? As they moved toward the door, Chen paused and looked back at Marcus, who remained slumped in his chair staring at the table covered with documents that had just destroyed everything he thought he knew about his own life. Mr. Wellington, she said with genuine sympathy, I'd recommend that you spend this evening reviewing your personal financial records very carefully. Tomorrow's discussion is going to focus on your individual assets versus your wife's individual assets, and I suspect you may find that conversation even more illuminating than today's revelations. The third morning brought with it an atmosphere of finality that was palpable from the moment Marcus entered the conference room. His usual Italian suits had been replaced by something off the rack, and the confidence that had once defined his every movement had been completely stripped away. Blackstone sat beside him with the defeated posture of a man who knew his career was about to suffer a very public and very humiliating blow. Chen arrived with Claire and a new addition to their legal team, a forensic accountant named David Park, whose reputation for uncovering hidden assets was legendary among divorce attorneys. Park carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who spoke fluent in numbers and had never met a financial structure he couldn't decode. Good morning, Chun said as she took her position at the head of the table. Yesterday, we established the ownership structure of the real estate and business assets. Today, we're going to examine the financial foundation that supports the Wellington lifestyle and determine exactly who owns what. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, Margaret, he said, his voice lacking any trace of his former arrogance. I understand that Claire has been more involved than I realized. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement that recognizes her contributions while acknowledging that I've been managing everything for 15 years. Chen opened her first file of the day. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate your willingness to negotiate, but first I think we need to establish exactly what assets you're bringing to this discussion. Mr. Park, could you please review your analysis of Mr. Wellington's personal financial position? Park opened a laptop and connected it to the conference room's presentation screen. Mr. Wellington, he said in a voice that was professionally neutral, I've conducted a comprehensive review of all bank accounts, investment portfolios, credit lines, and financial instruments associated with your name. Let's start with your checking account at First National Bank. A bank statement appeared on the screen showing Marcus's primary account. According to these records, Park continued, you are listed as an authorized user on this account, but the primary account holder is Claire Wellington. The account was opened in her name in 2008, and you were added as an authorized user following your marriage. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. That's my paycheck account, he said weakly. My salary from Wellington Dynamics goes into that account. I use it to pay our household expenses. Park nodded. You're correct that your salary is deposited into this account. However, since Mrs. Wellington is the primary account holder, the funds technically belong to her upon deposit. You've been essentially receiving an allowance from your wife's account for the past 15 years. Blackstone looked up from his notes. Surely Marcus has his own accounts, he said desperately. Personal savings, investment portfolios, retirement funds. Park switched to another screen showing investment account statements. I found 3 investment accounts that list Marcus Wellington as an account holder. However, upon closer examination, all 3 accounts were opened with initial deposits from Elmridge Holdings LLC and are technically managed accounts where Mr. Wellington serves as the beneficiary but not the owner. Marcus's voice was barely audible. What about my retirement account? My 401k from Wellington Dynamics. I've been contributing to that for 10 years. Park consulted his notes. The Wellington Dynamics 401k plan is interesting, Mr. Wellington. The company matches employee contributions at 100%, which is unusually generous. However, since Mrs. Wellington owns 60% of the company, She's essentially matching most of your retirement contributions with her own money. Chen opened another file. Mr. Park, could you review the credit and lending arrangements? Park switched to a new screen showing credit card and loan statements. This is where the picture becomes very clear, he said. Mr. Wellington, you have credit cards with limits totaling over $200,000. However, all of these credit lines are secured by assets owned by Elmridge Holdings LLC. Effectively, Mrs. Wellington has guaranteed all of your debt. Marcus was shaking his head slowly. The car loans, he said desperately. I financed my BMW myself. I make the payments every month. Park pulled up another document. The BMW is financed through Wellington Dynamics as a company vehicle. Since Mrs. Wellington owns 60% of the company, she's essentially subsidizing your transportation costs. Chen leaned forward. Mr. Wellington, do you own any assets in your name alone? Anything that you purchased with money that was unquestionably yours? Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing through 15 years of financial decisions that he now realized had been managed entirely by someone else. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet everyone had to strain to hear him. My watch, he said. I bought my Rolex with bonus money from the Henderson contract. Chun and Park exchanged a glance. Mr. Park, could you remind us who secured the Henderson contract and what strategic approach was used? Park consulted his earlier notes. According to the correspondence we reviewed yesterday, Mrs. Wellington developed the strategic approach for Henderson Industries. The bonus Mr. Wellington received was essentially payment for implementing his wife's business strategy using her company's resources. The conference room door opened, and a court reporter entered, followed by Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over some of the city's most contentious divorce cases. Her presence immediately transformed the informal conference into something much more serious. Good morning, Your Honor, Chen said, rising respectfully. Thank you for agreeing to review these emergency asset protection motions. Judge Morrison took her seat at the head of the table and gestured for everyone else to sit. Ms. Chun, she said in a voice that carried absolute authority, I've reviewed your preliminary filings, and I have to say I've never seen a case quite like this one. Mr. Wellington, I understand you've been representing yourself as the owner of significant assets that apparently belong to your wife. Marcus looked up at the judge with the expression of a man who had been caught in a lie so massive that denial was impossible. Your Honor, he said weakly, I honestly believe that I own those assets. I've been managing them, paying for them, making decisions about them for 15 years. Judge Morrison's expression was stern but not unsympathetic. Mr. Wellington, the law is very clear about the difference between managing assets and owning them. The fact that you've been an authorized user or a manager doesn't give you ownership rights. More concerning is the fact that you've apparently filed tax returns and loan applications claiming ownership of properties that belong to your wife. Blackstone stood up shakily. Your Honor, my client was operating under a good faith belief that these assets were marital property. The judge's gaze shifted to Blackstone with the intensity of a laser. Mr. Blackstone, your client has been operating a business using assets he doesn't own, living in houses he doesn't own, and spending money that belongs to his wife. That's not good faith. That's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. She turned back to Marcus. Mr. Wellington, I'm granting Mrs. Wellington's motion for immediate asset protection. Effective immediately, you are prohibited from making any financial decisions regarding properties owned by Elmridge Holdings LLC or any other entity controlled by Mrs. Wellington. You are also prohibited from accessing any bank accounts where you are listed as an authorized user rather than a primary account holder. Marcus stared at the judge in horror. Your Honor, he said desperately, if you freeze my access to those accounts, I have no money. I can't pay rent. I can't buy food. I can't even pay my attorney. Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly. Mr. Wellington, I'm not freezing the accounts. I'm simply clarifying that they belong to Mrs. Wellington and any access you have is at her discretion. She turned to Claire, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Wellington, do you intend to provide your estranged husband with reasonable support during these proceedings? Claire spoke for the first time that morning, her voice clear and confident. Your Honor, I'm prepared to provide Marcus with reasonable temporary support. I would suggest an amount equivalent to the median household income for this county. which should be adequate for his basic needs. The judge nodded approvingly. Very generous, Mrs. Wellington. Mr. Wellington, your wife is offering you approximately $50,000 annually in temporary support, which is more than most people in this county earn. I suggest you accept this offer gratefully. Marcus looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, finally understanding that the man who had walked into this conference room 3 days ago no longer existed. The successful entrepreneur, the business mogul, the master of his own destiny had been revealed as an elaborate fiction created by someone else's generosity and intelligence. Your Honor, he said quietly, I accept Mrs. Wellington's offer. Judge Morrison stood up, signaling that the proceedings were concluded. Mr. Wellington, she said with finality, I suggest you use this time to reflect on the difference between building something and managing something that belongs to someone else. Court is adjourned. 6 months later, the transformation was complete in ways that no one could have anticipated. The conference room at Blackstone, Meyer and Associates had hosted the final divorce proceedings, but the real changes had taken place in the wider world where reputations are made and destroyed by whispered conversations in boardrooms and country clubs. Claire Wellington, no longer hiding behind the modest demeanor of a suburban housewife, had emerged as one of the city's most formidable business leaders. Her Wharton MBA, which had been her secret for 15 years, was now prominently displayed in the corner office of the newly renamed Wellington Strategic Consulting. The company that Marcus had thought he built was thriving under her direct leadership, with 3 new Fortune 500 clients and an expanded team of consultants who marveled at her strategic insights. The legal aftermath had been swift and merciless. Marcus faced not only the complete dissolution of his imagined empire, but also a criminal investigation into his years of fraudulent representations on loan applications and tax returns. While he ultimately avoided jail time through a plea agreement, the perjury charges and financial fraud convictions had effectively ended any possibility of him working in the technology consulting field again. The final divorce decree had been almost anticlimactic. Judge Morrison had simply formalized what the evidence had already established. Claire retained ownership of all properties, all business assets, and all investment portfolios because they had always belonged to her. Marcus received exactly what he had brought to the marriage 15 years earlier, which turned out to be a $25,000 student loan debt and a 10-year-old Honda that was now worth approximately $3,000. Amber Stevens had not been seen since the second day of the conference proceedings. According to mutual acquaintances, she had immediately begun dating a pharmaceutical sales representative who actually owned the luxury car he drove and the downtown condo where he lived. Her departure had been so swift and complete that Marcus never even received a text message explaining her decision. Marcus himself had taken a position as a mid-level project manager at a small technology firm across town, earning roughly $60,000 annually. It was honest work, but the contrast with his former lifestyle was stark. He lived now in a modest apartment complex, drove a used Toyota, and had learned to shop for groceries with coupons. The man who had once dismissed his wife as a housewife while boasting about his business empire now depended on her generosity for basic financial stability. The support payments that Claire provided were exactly as Judge Morrison had ordered, $50,000 annually, which was indeed generous by most standards, but felt like poverty to someone who had grown accustomed to a lifestyle funded by someone else's millions. Marcus had quickly discovered that maintaining his previous standard of living would have required an income of over $400,000 annually, money that he had never actually earned but had always assumed belonged to him. The social consequences had been equally devastating. The country club membership that Marcus had treasured was tied to property ownership requirements that he no longer met. His children, Emma and Tyler, both excellent students who had inherited their mother's intelligence rather than their father's assumptions, divided their time between their parents, but made it clear that they understood exactly what had happened and who had been responsible for their educational opportunities and lifestyle. Claire had handled the transition with the same quiet competence she had always shown, but now that competence was visible to the world rather than hidden behind the facade of domestic life. She served on 2 nonprofit boards, had been featured in the Business Journal as one of the city's emerging leaders, and spoke regularly at conferences about strategic business development. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the situation that Marcus now worked for a company that was trying to compete with Wellington Strategic Consulting for several major contracts. His former colleagues, who had once treated him as an equal, now saw him as someone who had been living an elaborate fiction for over a decade. I hope this story has resonated with you, especially if you've ever felt underestimated or overlooked in your own life. The truth is, people like Claire exist everywhere, quietly making things work while others take the credit. Have you ever experienced something similar, either personally or witnessed someone being underestimated because of their role or position? Share your thoughts in the comments, because these kinds of revelations happen more often than people realize. Marcus had requested one final meeting with Claire, ostensibly to discuss modifications to the support agreement, but really to try to understand how his entire life had been redefined in the space of 3 days. They met at a coffee shop near Claire's office, a neutral location that somehow emphasized the vast distance between their current positions. Claire arrived dressed in the executive attire that had become her new normal, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped hiding her capabilities. Marcus looked older than his 43 years, the stress of the past months having taken a visible toll on his appearance and demeanor. "Claire," he said after they had ordered their coffee, "I need to understand something. If you were this capable, this intelligent, this successful, why did you let me believe I was in charge for 15 years? Why did you stay in the background?" Claire's response was immediate and clear. "Marcus, I was never in the background. I was always exactly where I needed to be to ensure our family's success and security. The difference is that you assumed managing assets meant owning them, and you confused being the public face of something with being the actual decision maker." She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm but firm. "I made a choice to focus on building real value rather than public recognition. While you were networking and presenting and taking credit, I was actually creating the strategies and structures that generated our wealth. I was content to let you have the spotlight as long as you were willing to implement my vision." Marcus stared into his coffee cup. "But why didn't you ever tell me the truth about who owned what? Why didn't you ever claim credit for your contributions?" Claire's smile was patient, almost maternal. "Marcus, I tried to include you in strategic discussions hundreds of times. Every suggestion I made, every recommendation I offered, every solution I provided, I presented to you as a partnership. You chose to see those contributions as casual observations from a housewife rather than professional insights from someone with an MBA and 15 years of business experience." She gathered her purse, signaling that the conversation was ending. "I never hid my capabilities from you, Marcus. You simply chose not to see them because acknowledging my expertise would have required acknowledging that your success was built on someone else's foundation." As Claire stood to leave, Marcus made one final attempt to reclaim some dignity from the wreckage of his former life. "What happens now?" he asked. "Do we just pretend the past 15 years never happened?" Claire paused at the question, her expression softening slightly. "The past 15 years weren't a lie, Marcus. We raised 2 wonderful children together. We built a successful business together, even if you didn't understand the true nature of our partnership. We created value and stability and opportunity, even if the ownership structure wasn't what you believed it to be." She turned to go, then looked back one final time. "The only thing that changed is that you finally learned who you really are versus who you thought you were. Everything else was always exactly what it appeared to be to anyone who was paying attention." Marcus sat alone in the coffee shop long after Claire had left, finally understanding that the housewife he had dismissed for 15 years had been the architect of everything he had valued about his life, and the business empire he thought he had built had been hers all along.